Longtime Newsweek columnist and senior editor Jonathan Alter left the magazine in 2011 after 28 years. The NBC News political analyst and author now has a new role with Bloomberg News. His New York Times nonfiction bestseller, The Promise, President Obama Year One, is now out in paperback. We'll talk to Jonathan Alter about President Obama and 2012 as Give and Take continues its political coverage in this extraordinary year in political news. Jonathan Alter, welcome to the show.
Hi, Julie.
So I want to start off with a recent New York Times article that described how economists are disappointed by the government's efforts to bring about economic recovery through the stimulus. Now, interestingly, that article didn't refer to President Obama at all. Having inherited more than one epic crisis, so to speak, from the Bush administration, how much of the current economy do you think the president now owns?
I think he owns the whole thing. The voters are not very good about apportioning blame to the old government. That's just not the way it works in this country. Why do you think that is?
Why do you think people have a short memory?
Because that's part of the nature of being an American, to always look to the future. And, you know, it is, at this point, it's on his watch. Now, to blame him, as some Republicans have been trying to do, for the recession is preposterous. When he came into office, the economy was losing about 800,000 jobs a month. And if we'd stayed on that pace, Julie, by the end of 2009, we would have been in another Great Depression without any exaggeration. So Barack Obama and the Congress and the Federal Reserve prevented a second Great Depression. They've gotten very little credit for that. But now they own, so to speak, the rather anemic recovery.
Now, recent polls are showing that up to 70% of Americans feel that we're headed in the wrong direction. But yet the polls also show that President Obama would beat any Republican challenger, at least at this point. So do you think the poll results hint that Americans realize that the enormity of the challenges that the president faces and are really cutting him some political slack, so to speak?
I think people are not yet focused on re-election because that's a 2012 issue. They tend to like Barack Obama personally, but a lot of them, you know, have lost their homes, or they or people they know have lost their jobs, and things have not been good in America in the last 3 or 4 years. And so, you know, it's understandable why a lot of folks would think things were on the wrong track. In terms of the matchups with the Republicans, it's just too early because we don't know who he's going to run against. If he runs against a flaky candidate, he'll win in a landslide.
Such as who?
Donald Trump. I don't know. I mean, who knows who could get nominated? Things are wide open in the Republican Party. Michelle Bachmann. But if he ran against a more serious Republican, which is much more likely, you're going to have a close election. And anybody who tells you right now they know for sure what's going to happen has not covered politics, has not been a close observer of recent elections, because it's just too early to know for sure what's going to happen. A lot of it depends on, most of it depends on where the economy is in the summer and fall of next year.
Now, President Obama has spoken almost nostalgically, if you will, about how he's lost some of his freedom and anonymity now that he's in the Oval Office. And he's also spoken rather candidly about the frustrations and challenges of being president. How much, in talking about moving forward in the campaign trail, how much of that trademark enthusiasm is he going to need to bring back to the campaign trail?
A lot. He has to be pumped, you know, and confident and up and look like he really wants a second term for him to get it. Because if people sense any reluctance on his part, they're not going to respond well to that. He is ambivalent, though. In The Promise, I have a quote from an old friend of his from law school. And he saw this person, I think it was in late 2009, and said something to the effect of, well, I'm going to run for re-election because, you know, I'll be damned if I'm going to turn overall credit for all the good things we've gotten done to Mitt Romney or somebody like that after we've been through all this crap. You know, so there was this sense that he has he became president at a very, very difficult time in American history. He did well. He prevented a depression. He didn't, provide the right solution for every problem. He made some mistakes, but generally he did well. He had the strongest legislative record of any president since Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. But he was dealt a very bad hand. And, I have a chapter in the Promise called The Shovel Brigade. You remember what that is? At the end of the circus, they come around and shovel up after the elephants. And that's a lot of what President Obama felt he was doing, in his first couple of years, was shoveling up after the elephants who had left him with a series of big messes. And he's still digging out of that hole. Remember, just in terms of the deficit, for instance, which is only one of several big problems that he's had to face, when Bill Clinton left office in 2001, we had a $200 billion surplus. When George W. Bush left office in 2009, we had a $1.2 trillion deficit. And then on top of that, there were a series of emergency measures that required a lot more government spending, which, by the way, and this is forgotten, Republicans, like Ronald Reagan's chief economic advisor, Martin Feldstein, they all agreed that when we were facing a possible depression, there was no alternative but to have the government spend a lot more money with the stimulus.
Why do you think that that's forgotten? Because that's really a critical point. It seems that many Americans, Republicans and independents in particular, gloss over that fact.
They do, because, first of all, there was so much going on so fast in early 2009 that so much water coming over the side of the boat every day that it was really hard for people, even in Washington, to keep track of all the things we were doing to bail out. And it's also an abstraction, and this is something that when I interviewed the president, we discussed. It's hard to get credit for something that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So if you prevent a depression, that depression is an abstraction. It's something that people might fear happening, but they didn't actually suffer through it. So it was easier. My earlier book on Franklin Roosevelt's debut in office, The Defining Moment, about 1933, was much easier for Roosevelt, even though the condition of the country was worse, because when he took over, we were at the depths of the Depression. So anything he did was going to be a huge advance over where we were. Whereas with President Obama, it was preventing something from happening. But even with Roosevelt, Julie, there was no gratitude. So he compared his situation when the wealthy called him a traitor to his class, and he had saved their fortunes. They were going to lose everything. There was no bank deposit insurance in 1933. Right? They were going to lose everything. So he compared it to a lifeguard, Roosevelt did, who saves a drowning man, and then the drowning man comes back a couple of years later and says, "Hey, lifeguard, you lost my silk hat. What happened to my silk hat?" And I asked the Obama people about this, and they said, "Well, we actually prefer the metaphor of the Good Samaritan who comes by and he sees these dogs, these Doberman pinschers, the Banks, by the side of the road, and they're whimpering, and they're in trouble, and they're about to go under." And the Good Samaritan, saves the dogs, and then they turn around and bite them. In this case, they lobbied heavily against the Dodd-Frank financial re-regulation bill because people forget, as you say, they forget that they had lost in 2008 a third, a quarter, sometimes even half of their portfolio, and it's back now, so they just pocket that.
Obviously, there's considerable debate going on right now about how do we get ourselves out of debt. And one of the popular options is to tax the wealthy. And that's what I really want to talk about, because the idea of wealth redistribution is really a loaded word and a loaded phrase to many. And how can the president take this idea of wealth distribution and make it more palatable to the American public?
Well, first of all, the president, I think, is being a little bit misleading in suggesting that just raising taxes on the wealthy is going to solve our deficit problems. It's not. There's some very tough choices, and he mentioned this in his speech at George Washington, that are going to have to be made on entitlements that relate to people who are not wealthy. But making the wealthy pay more, both in terms of entitlements, taxing their entitlements, and in terms of their taxes, returning the tax levels to where they were in the Clinton era when the economy was very good. That's not class warfare. That's just going back to what we had under Clinton. So a lot of this is just nonsense when they say, oh, he's a socialist, he's a redistributionist, he wants to take from, you know, the Ryan plan cuts taxes down to 25% for the wealthiest. It's just interesting, since we're talking a little bit about history today, to think about when John F. Kennedy was president. A lot of conservatives like to point to his tax cuts. The top rate was 90%, right. And they brought it down to 70, and then they brought it down lower. So this idea that somehow we're and I'm not defending that.
And people forget that as well.
That was way too high. Right. I'm not defending that, but this idea that somehow, you know, taxing the wealthy in 37, 38% is somehow confiscatory or un-American is a figment of the very effective imagination of the American right, that they have been able to create this impression that somehow a reasonable rate of taxation that is commensurate and actually lower than that in other countries is somehow redistributionist
or even anti-democratic, as the right likes to challenge. So it seems
we shouldn't even be arguing on their side of the playing field, because and by the way, the public sides with the president on this. This has all been polled, so just, you know, you wouldn't know it from a lot of the coverage, but Paul Ryan's idea for cutting, basically ending Medicare, turning it into a voucher system, extremely unpopular. President Obama's plan to tax those who make over $250,000 more, extremely popular. So somehow, if you look at the press coverage, because the Republicans are much more effective at making a lot of noise, you would miss the fact that the American people right now are on the president's side on this, at least as far as the polls go. That doesn't assure his reelection. If you have super high gas prices or continued anemic recovery, he could be beaten. There's a lot of ways to lose. But in terms of the basic structure of where the public is, the public doesn't think this is redistributionist. This is something that you might hear, you know, on the Upper East Side or from people in country clubs.
Yeah, they don't think it's redistributionist. They don't think it's anti-democratic. But the president clearly needs to get that message out there to the American people and point out, just as you're saying, that the polls are actually on his side and that this is something.
But you can't really say, hey, the polls are on my side. That sounds bad. But you're right that they've had a problem with the messaging. And this has been a consistent problem for this president. And, you know, when I asked him about it, you know, when I interviewed him, I asked all his top people about it, and they copped to it to a certain extent. And to me, the biggest surprise about Barack Obama is we expected him to ace communication, again, A+. He was this silver-tongued orator from 2008, and that he would struggle in executive leadership, struggle to get things done because he had no experience. And it turned out to be the reverse.